The romance turned tragedy that some say plunged the whole world into war.
But before we start, please take a moment to give this video a like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll never miss these great stories.
On January 30th, 1889, the bodies of Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria-Hungary and his mistress Baroness Mary Vetsera were discovered in a tragedy of global proportions. The loss rocked the imperial family to its core, and they, along with the rest of the world, were left wondering what happened. Even decades later, experts still debate why these two high-profile figures died, and if their demise really caused the start of World War I. From the moment the 30-year-old royal and his lover, 13 years his junior, were found dead in bed at his hunting lodge in Mayerling, Austria, everyone was stunned. Not only was his death untimely, but Crown Prince Rudolph was also the heir to the throne. Right off the bat, it was obvious that this was no accident. In fact, there were some specifics about the crime scene that painted a complicated story. But there wasn't time to sort out the details. No matter what had happened, this was a serious scandal for the imperial family, but not necessarily one that had come without warning signs. Prior to his death, Crown Prince Rudolph wasn't exactly the royal example that his father Franz Joseph hoped he'd be. The source of the tension? They were total political opposites. The emperor, a strict traditionalist, was in stark opposition to his son, a critical progressive. Ultimately, Prince Rudolph felt his father disapproved of him, and his lifestyle choices didn't improve matters. The Crown Prince began seeing Baroness Marie Vetsera in 1888, but there was one glaring problem. He was married. Despite having a wife, Princess Stephanie of Belgium, and a daughter at home, the royal wasn't shy about his rampant playboy lifestyle. He engaged in numerous affairs, though that was only one of his many problems. With a revolving door of lovers, Crown Prince Rudolph contracted STDs. It's believed he had either syphilis or gonorrhea, but whichever he passed along to his wife, rendering her infertile. He was also heavily addicted to morphine. It's no surprise that his extreme and indulgent lifestyle was the mask of a depressed person. As for the young Baroness, her involvement with Rudolph was rather new. Some accounts say their fling lasted 3 months, while others say 3 years. Just like the timeline, opinions on the seriousness of Rudolph's affections vary. This was further complicated by the fact that he was also seeing another woman on the side, an actress named Mitzi Casper. So it was with a great mixture of horror and urgency to control the narrative that the imperial family handled the bloody death scene. At a glance, there were 2 bodies laying on the bed, appearing to have succumbed to gunshot wounds. But as to how and why Prince Rudolph and Marie Vetsera were killed, there were several theories. Some people suspected the killings were enacted on behalf of German agents, looking to silence Prince Rudolph for his vocal anti-German position. If this scenario were true, Marie Vetsera was killed simply for her proximity to the royal, a tragic case of the wrong place at the wrong time. However, several factors of the scene contradicted that. Medical professionals observed that Baroness Marie Vetsera died long before Prince Rudolph. Given that fact, some suggested a rather grim situation played out, where Vetsera died as a result of an abortion gone wrong. It's been theorized Rudolph ended his life in a final act of heartbreak. Still, there was one clue on Vetsera's person that was too intentional to ignore. In the hands of the young woman, they found a wilted, blood-covered rose. Had she known the end was coming, or was that prop added by a murderer? Given the context, the family quickly believed Rudolph and Marie knew they were about to meet their end, and they had a theory of how the tragic end unfolded. Rudolph's other mistress, Mitzi Kasper, came forward to say he had proposed a suicide pact to her only a month prior. Based on that unsettling information, it's most widely accepted that he asked Marie Vetsera to do the same. The family scrambled to cover up the PR catastrophe as best they could, hoping to stem any potential backlash. As described by author and historian Frederick Morton in his book A Nervous Splendor, Vienna 1888 to 1889, there were immediate efforts to remove every trace of the Baroness Maria Vetsera. While the agent drew up the document, the physician washed caked blood from the corpse. Then it was dressed in a coat and hat in boa, veil, and shoes. It was stood up. The two uncles linked arms with their niece and walked her slowly out into the night, past any possible suspicious eyes, though the howling winds passed Rudolph's barking dogs, to Count Stocko's carriage. A hearse would, of course, have given away too much. Morton's book continued. Instead, Vetsera was quickly buried in a cemetery chosen only for its proximity. Then there was the matter of explaining how Crown Prince Rudolph died, since the truth of his death drastically complicated matters further. If word got out that it was a suicide, the late prince wouldn't be allowed a Catholic burial in the imperial vaults, per tradition. Eventually, the family came clean about the suspected suicide to the church, claiming the prince had only done so in a deranged state of mind. No public mention of Baroness Marie Vetsera's death was made. Her family reburied her shortly after, replacing her hastily chosen wooden coffin for one made of copper, but sadly her rest would be disturbed several more times. Marie Vetsera's remains were targeted by grave robbers several times throughout the decades, most recently in 1991. After 2 years, though, the famed crypt thief Helmut Fletzelsteiner was discovered as the culprit, and her remains were returned to the gravesite. As for more recent attempts, according to reporting by the Los Angeles Times, the family has refused all recent investigative endeavors to exhume her body. Since Prince Rudolph was the heir to the throne, his untimely death posed a major problem for Austro-Hungarian succession. It devastated his parents, Emperor Franz Joseph, and particularly Elizabeth of Bavaria, who had long battled depression. While they grieved, they still had to sort out the looming crisis of who would run the empire. Luckily, Emperor Franz had a brother. The Emperor of Austria's younger brother, Archduke Karl Ludwig, was the next in line, though his claim to the throne was made murky by false rumors that he'd renounced his position. Sadly, Karl never had the opportunity to really step into his own reign. He died of typhoid 7 years after his nephew Rudolph in 1896. Next, they looked to Karl Ludwig's son, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But that ended just as catastrophically. As you might remember from history class, the assassination of Archduke and his wife in 1914 was a catalyst for World War II. But even after the Austro-Hungarian ruler sparked the war, the families of Rudolph and Marie Vetsera kept quiet about all the evidence surrounding their deaths. It turned out that both families had proof to substantiate the suicide pact for decades. In 1926, letters written by Marie Vetsera to her family were discovered, hidden away in a bank safety deposit box. As the teen wrote plainly in a letter to her mother, "I am happier in death than I was in life." Sadly, the high-profile death of Rudolph and the subsequent scandal wasn't the only one to hit the Austro-Hungarian imperial family. For many years, Rudolph's mother, Empress Elizabeth Cece of Australia, was in a crumbling mental health state. Even early on, her friction with her position gave the royals cause for concern. Born in 1837, Cece was from Munich in the German state of Bavaria. Her childhood sounds beautiful. She spent her youth playing in the Bavarian woods with her 7 siblings. They would ride horses and climb the nearby mountains. this peace wouldn't last. On April 25, 1854, she married the 23-year-old Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria when she was only 16. Austria was Europe's second largest empire at the time, so this union was an important one. Franz was a kind husband to Sisi. He'd known her from a young age, since the two were cousins and he'd long been interested in her. The feeling wasn't mutual. When they were courting, she was too nervous to eat anything around him. As Sisi grew used to living in the Hofburg Imperial Palace, she drew further inward. She hated being in the court and didn't have any friends. Franz and his mother, Archduchess Sophie, ignored and abhorred her neglect for her social life, respectively. Instead, she focused on other aspects of royal life, like bearing children. In her first 4 years of marriage, Sisi gave birth to 3 children, one dying in infancy. Crown Prince Rudolph and Archduchess Gisela successfully survived. One major part of Sisi's unhappiness was her obsession with her appearance. She spent 3 hours a day getting her hair done and another hour cinching her waist. She also followed a strict diet and exercise routine. This wasn't healthy either. For a time, Sisi only consumed broth. Later in life, she switched to raw milk, supplied by her personal cow, oranges, and eggs. She was also known for her daily commitment to exercising. For hours, Sisi rode horses, fences, hiked, and did circus-based workouts. She even had a space for weightlifting. Her dual exercising and restrictive diet would be diagnosed as anorexia in the modern day. When she wasn't exercising, she was extremely unhappy. The Empress had a nervous breakdown in 1862, which she blamed on the palace being like a prison. "I want always to be on the move," Sisi wrote. "Every ship I see sailing away fills me with the greatest desire to be on it." Back in the castle, Sisi grew interested in Hungary. The area was prone to rebellion under her husband's rule, and Sisi was on the people's side. She brought Hungarian nationals into her personal staff, angering the Viennese royals. Finally, Hungary and Austria worked out an agreement, and Franz and Sisi became the king and queen of Hungary. This formed the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1867. Hungarians loved Sisi because of her part in the Austro-Hungarian Compromise. Being beloved was something Sisi enjoyed. She often visited to hospitals and charities, only bringing her lady-in-waiting. There, she spoke with the ill, asking them about what they needed and holding hands with dying patients. Sisi fell deeper into her own mental instability just after this time. Marie Valérie, another daughter of hers, found her mother laughing alone in a bathtub. She constantly spoke of suicide and was desperate for relief. Sadly, tragedy was just around the corner. "Rudolph's bullet killed my faith," Sisi told her daughter Marie Valérie. Rudolph was a progressive ruler who she'd hoped would carry the Austria-Hungary Empire into the future. Now this dream was dead, along with her only surviving son. Sisi declared she would travel the world over until I drown and am forgotten. She moved through Europe and North Africa alone. At age 51, she got an anchor tattoo. Deep down, she wanted to die. She would eventually get her wish on September 10, 1898, while she was in Geneva. Italian anarchist Luigi Liceni also happened to be in Switzerland. Luigi planned to assassinate Prince Henry of Orleans to protest the monarchy. Luigi's anarchist friends murdered a Russian czar, an American president, 2 Spanish premiers, a French president, and an Italian king over the course of 30 years. Their idea to add a Swiss prince to the list was spoiled when he canceled his trip to Geneva. Luigi's disappointment wouldn't last. Soon he'd learn of another noble who was in the city, Sisi. As he walked along the docks to board a ship, he stabbed her with a file. She thought she'd only been punched. but Cece died on that dock, put out of her own misery via internal bleeding. She was still only 51, and she left her remaining children and husband behind. While this empress gained no pleasure from being noble, others went to incredible lengths to be treated like a royal. In 1928, a woman with sunken eyes and a crooked smile arrived in New York. It was clear that she didn't fit the traditional idea of what royalty should be. And yet, when she spoke, she immediately gained the world's attention. "I am the lost heir of the Romanov family," she announced. But instead of being greeted with gasps, the American press responded with skepticism. After all, she wasn't the first woman to claim to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia Romanov of Russia. In fact, in the 10 years since the Romanov family was executed, at least 6 women, probably more, had come forward falsely claiming to be Anastasia. So when this tattered woman showed up in New York City, people couldn't help but scoff. They wanted proof that she was the real deal, something all those other imposters had always failed to do. If this woman really was the lost princess, she had to prove it, which she did by simply pointing to her jaw. She alleged that her jaw had been broken nearly 10 years earlier when she made her escape from the communist soldiers who had murdered her entire family. The way she told this story was so genuine that people believed her, including someone from Anastasia's past. The man was Gleb Botkin, the son of the Romanov family's physician, who was also murdered by the communist revolutionaries. Gleb had played with Anastasia as a child, and something mysterious about this woman made him believe her story. Gaining the support of Gleb Botkin, a respected member of high society, convinced the public that she was truly Anastasia. The fact that she was covered in scars, which she claimed to have gotten during her escape, only helped clinch the public's belief. She became known as Anna Anderson, the lost Grand Duchess, and a fixture of New York high society. She was no longer tattered and pale, but wrapped up in expensive clothes with access to the best products and services money could buy. As she hopped from one luxurious hotel to the other, she met with many Romanov relatives and former acquaintances of the Romanov family. Most were astounded with how much Anna resembled the young Anastasia they once knew. Others, however, weren't so easily convinced. Though she looked like Anastasia, other things just didn't add up. She had trouble recalling certain details about her childhood, and her grasp on languages that Anastasia had been fluent in was shaky at best. But still, the lost Romanov safe and sound in New York City? It was too amazing of a prospect to be fake. She had been through so much, endured such violence and trauma, that some degree of mental illness was to be expected. Anna spent months at a time in the homes of society's most respected men and women. It didn't seem to matter that Anna's accent was decidedly German, and that her behavior was erratic at best. People loved the idea of having Russia's Grand Duchess in their home. Inconsistencies aside, Anna's most ardent supporters all had one goal in mind: to have Anna's status as Grand Duchess Anastasia legally recognized. Doing so would have benefits that go beyond whatever fortune her family had left, a fortune eyed by many of her supporters. Anastasia's survival would also be a symbol to Russia's communist leaders of the strength and resilience of Imperial Russia. These both sounded like great ideas to Anna and her supporters, and if one man hadn't intervened, things would have turned out much differently. The Grand Duke of Hesse, Anastasia's uncle, was one of the visiting relatives who doubted Anna's identity. To learn more about her, he hired a private investigator, and what the investigator uncovered left the Duke infuriated. The investigator made a startling claim. Anna, he said, was actually a woman named Franziska Szankowska, and she didn't exactly have royal roots. Franziska was a Polish-German factory worker who had randomly disappeared in 1920. Franziska not only had a history of mental illness, but a 1916 factory explosion left her covered with scars, both physical and mental. These allegations about Anna made some ripples in the press, but they didn't amount to much, and Anna continued to be regarded as Anastasia. Not that the court system was quite ready to recognize her as such. Years passed. Anna lost multiple court battles about her identity, and it slowly but surely became public knowledge that Anna probably wasn't Anastasia. Still, people loved to watch her pretend. They loved it so much that a French play, Anastasia, debuted in 1954, followed by the 1956 film starring Ingrid Bergman. For decades, Anna tried to prove her royal status despite mounting doubts from the public. She died in 1984, 7 years before the truth finally came out.